Today I want to do a brief overview of some basic tips for poetry, how to understand poetry, ways that you can approach it. Um, you can consider this my version of the Billy Collins poem, Introduction to Poetry, without actually turning it into a poem. So I know most of us do have issues with poetry. um, that many of us are not fans of it. And this is something I'll get into a little bit later with one of my pieces of advice for poetry a little bit later on. But just know I understand where most of you are coming from. In fact, when I was in school, both in high school and I guess my first year as a freshman in college, I was not the biggest fan of poetry. So I understand how most of you are feeling. Um, but it wasn't until after my freshman year and some good teachers that I finally became to understand poetry, such as it is, and came up with my own ways of approaching it um, that seemed to work for me at least. So I'm going to pass some of those ideas on to you guys. So here are 6 pieces of advice for reading and or understanding a poem. My first piece of advice is to read it many times or multiple times. You know, poems for the most part are pretty short, usually less than a half a page, with the exception of epic poetry, which can go on for many, many pages. It can be the length of a short story. But for the most part, most poems are not that long. Half a page or less than half a page. So, given that a poem is usually brief and has very focused subject matter, I really do suggest reading a poem more than once. 3, 4 times is a really good idea. So you can start to develop some ideas about it. I'm not going to say you're going to get a meaning from it right off the bat. That can come later after you kind of let the poem kind of sit with you and you think about it for a few hours. You kind of go back to it later on, but just kind of let it fester in your brain, kind of roll around up there and try to have some initial reaction to it at the very least. You could say, hey, I like this poem or I didn't like this poem. Here's kind of what I'm thinking as to why I feel this way or another way. And that's always a great place to start. And then from there, you can kind of build upon that, read over the poetic terms, see how those might work with applying them to the poem, and you can develop some meaning ideas from that. So that's advice number 1. Advice number 2, reading the poem aloud. Poetry is something that is meant to be heard just as much as it is to be seen and read. A lot of poems have very audible qualities to them, and you really won't understand those things until you hear them. So read it aloud. Now, if you don't like that idea of reading a poem aloud yourself, you can go online and find a lot of poems that are being read by somebody else. So find a poem and play it back that way, but at least find some way so you can hear it. Good part of the enjoyment of a poem is to hear it. So that's advice number 2. Third point, and this is what I was talking about before in terms of our disdain, dislike, hatred, confusion, apprehension, whatever word you want to use that many of us apply to poetry. And again, I was one of these people when I was a student. So we have this apprehension towards poetry. Hate it, can't understand it, or maybe you hate it because you can't understand it, whatever it might be. So my best piece of advice here is to think about something you do like, and that is music. And I would say 99.9% of you like music of some form or fashion. So yes, music. Think about music. What do they have in common, you might ask yourself and ask me? Well, just about everything. Music is a form of poetry. All music, from rap to country, rock and roll, classical. Well, classical is maybe a different type of music. If it's classical with words to it, then yes. But anyway, um, you can apply all those poetic terms that I posted up earlier and use them to understand music, from metaphor, simile, onomatopoeia, um, and everything in between. You can use those things to appreciate and understand music in a lot of ways. So you might be sitting there and going, but Mr. M, music, songs, these things are sung and poetry is not. Well, that's not entirely true. If we go back in time to the Middle Ages, just about all poetry was sung, believe it or not. You would have these wandering bards that would go from town to town with their poems, and they would sing them aloud. So, there's one way that poetry is just like music. But then you might say, Mr. M, songs, music have musical instruments in the background to go along with the song. Poetry does not. Well, guess what? Go back to the Middle Ages. Not only were these poems sung, but they also had musical accompaniment to them. These bards would have a lute or a lyre, some sort of string instrument usually. And as they're singing the song, they would play a tune to go along with it. So, two things to prove that poetry and music not very different. In fact, I would say they are the same thing, but you just have to think of them that way. And again, most of us don't, and I understand that, but there's really no reason not to. So, taking all that, you say you don't like poetry. I say, not true. You like a form of poetry, the most, popular form ever, and that is music. So, think about how you understand songs that you really like. Use that and apply that to poetry. All right. Fourth piece of advice: read the title of a poem very closely. Treat the title of a poem as if it were the first line of a poem. Poems are made up of stanzas. Some stanzas are like paragraphs that you would find in an essay. And those stanzas are made up of lines, and lines are like sentences that make up paragraphs. So treat the title of a poem as the first line of a poem. Don't just kind of dismiss it as not being part of the poem. Titles are very important. They can give you a clue as to what the poem may be about. So think about what that title could mean in relationship to the poem. Point number 5, don't put all your energy into finding a single meaning of a poem. Poems are more than just single meanings. There's so many aspects that goes into poetry. And this is one of the points that Billy Collins in his poem Introduction to Poetry is trying to make us aware of. I'm not saying don't think about a meaning, but there are other things to enjoy about a poem. But as you write and talk about poetry for this class, meanings are important, but I'm not going to lock you guys down into one single meaning. I'm not going to say, hey, the poem means this and only this, and all of you need to get on board with my meaning of a poem. Poetry doesn't really work that way. With one or two exceptions, some poets might say it means this and only this, but we don't necessarily have to listen to the poet. We can come up with our own meanings of a poem, as long as we can back them up with what is in the poem. So that's important. You can't just say, hey, this poem is about pretzels, and just because you say so. No, you have to find something within the poem that suggests, yes, it is about pretzels, or whatever it might be. But the idea that poems only mean one thing and that's it, that's a load of crap in my mind. Sixth and final point. Most poems, these meanings about poems, come from the feelings or the ideas that the poems elicit. So when you're thinking about the meaning of a poem or a song, what feelings come to mind? What ideas are present there? So that's what I'm talking about when we talk about meaning. Not so much about themes or plots, although some poems can have themes and plots, like epic poetry, especially when we're talking about plots. But focus more on the feelings that you get, or a feeling from a certain poem, or an idea that you might think about as you read a certain poem. All right, so those are my 6 pieces of advice for you guys to approach poetry. I hope these are useful things as you continue to read, go back to read poems, and apply that to our class. All right.